welcome to a very special episode of The Partial Historians. I am Dr. G.
And I am Dr. Ran.
And with us today is the very amazing, talented, intelligent Liz Smith.
Thank you.
Easily
it's a pleasure to be here.
One of the foremost academics of her generation.
Right.
She is the interesting filling in our sandwich.
We're actually very excited to have Liz on the program. She's been working on her PhD, which has just been completed. Dr. Pending is how we were describing this situation.
Thank you. Touch wood.
But we're pretty excited. The thing that is the focus of Liz's research is probably something that I should not be the best person to describe. Perhaps you should be the person to describe it.
Me? It's one of those issues when you have to describe 100,000 words in just a minute.
I'm going to say it's about fashion.
Yeah.
And
fashion
the ancient world.
Fashion. Yeah.
And this was something that we're interested in because we all you probably came into this, I suppose, because like all of us in your undergraduate days, you liked looking at gender and what women were up to in the classical world.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I think that looking at the way women are represented in the ancient world tells us a lot about perceptions of women, and it can, to an extent, tell us about their lived experiences. Not a great deal, unfortunately, because everything that we know about women is, as always, described by men. But essentially my thesis looks at, it's still there.
It's not going anywhere now. It's definitely looking at things.
It's still there. I looked at representations of head coverings, so what we would usually refer to as veils, on statuary evidence. So looking at statues in the round, so portrait statues, and on sepulchral reliefs, so grave monuments. And things
Interesting.
like
And this is something that people might not necessarily, I mean, on a podcast, obviously, visuals are not a thing that we usually go into in a huge amount of detail.
Yeah.
So women haven't been a big feature of our narrative thus far because, men.
Yeah.
So can you give us a rough idea of, what would a Roman woman roughly be wearing?
Well, that's a very good question, Dr. Rad, because essentially, as we say, all of the source material that describes female clothing from both the Greek and Roman perspective is composed by men.
Yeah. And
so we have to take what they say with a very large pinch of salt, in my opinion. But we can consider things in terms of drapery and status.
Yeah.
So your elite ladies would be very well adorned, very fashionable, and often very modestly dressed. We can presume that. Your average slave or labourer or working class woman who goes about her daily life, well, that's another story indeed, because the representations of even these women are often idealized, and it's very difficult to tell what they would have worn. But we have general garments like the stola and the palla for married citizen Roman women. I take issue with the palla being a garment for married women, but that's another story. But yeah, we have all of these garments, and they are described in the ancient sources. And when you look at statues and how elite women are represented on those statues, I think another important thing to remember is that the garments would have been coloured. So they would have had all of these different dyes and very reds, purples, even blues, those kinds of hues would have been.
They would just be walking around in white.
Well, yeah.
Get the happy sound.
So I think this is a really important issue that we have in general terms with the evidence for women in the ancient past, is that our written source material doesn't hold up a good mirror for us. And so the work that you're doing looking at physical evidence and statuary is a way into thinking about everyday life where we don't have a narrative necessarily, but we can start to build a visualization of what the past might have looked like for women in a way that's more substantial than what we can get from, say, the written evidence and sometimes even epigraphy.
And I think it's so important to understand what women were wearing, not just because, like, I'm just a girl and I want to know, but because when I think about the way that I dress, for example, as opposed to women in the past have dressed, the fact that I'm able to wear pants, without it being, like a national crisis, not just pants, but jeans even, it tells you a lot about the kinds of freedoms that I have, as well as potentially my status and all that kind of stuff. So I think clothing is something really interesting and important to consider in terms of what their lives would have been like and, their position in society, definitely.
Yeah, it's very true. And I think the other thing that we have to remember is that even the representations of female clothing in sculpture, we're still looking at an idealized portrait. You wouldn't represent yourself in the ancient equivalent of jeans in your grave monument for your family that you've spent every last dollar that you had.
I know. How good does it make your ass look? Isn't
it? So that you pick the thing that's going to make you look nice.
Yeah, well, I must admit, whenever we look at these sorts of sources with my students, I'm always like, look, it's like Instagram. You don't just, whack on any old photo and not put a filter on. Yeah. This is something that someone's actually working really hard to produce, that like they're carving in stone, not like a selfie that you took in a second.
Yes, it is the very definition of permanent. Yeah. So much like, the cloud is permanent because I don't even know how to get there, but
none of us do.
But literally carved in stone.
So I guess the other thing that I'm really interested in your topic in particular is that, as you know, I've spent a lot of my academic career looking at Rome and Greece in film. And when you look at women in Rome and Greece on film, they tend to be rather lasciviously.
Oh yeah, sex sells, everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there tends to be quite a lot of cleavage. So maybe some thigh high splits. The shoulder is very prominent.
So I think this might tie in nicely because you mentioned the stola and the palla as being part of features of Roman elite dress for women. It might be worth describing what they would look like on the female body, potentially, in order to counteract this narrative of the sort of the reveal.
Flesh.
Well, if we consider the stola essentially as an undergarment, so your petticoat, the issue with the stola is you can't really see it on statues because it's an undergarment.
Hard to find, but we think it's there.
Sometimes it's there. You can see it in a couple of things.
She looks like she's wearing layers. It must have been nippy when.
This is a great autumn look.
Yeah. Whereas the palla is much more visible and easy to recognise because it's a shawl or wrap that can be adorned and rearranged in a number of ways, in a number of materials. If you think of it as a kind of scarf that was 6 meters long by 2 meters wide, there's a lot of variation you can have in that.
So you can do a lot with that.
Yeah. Large and heavy, and in the poses that we see in statues, and speaking from personal experience, when you try to recreate those poses, walking around just in one room, incredibly difficult. So if you were wearing a palla in any kind of everyday sense, you'd probably think of it as much more of just a wrap or something that was draped, as opposed to elaborately encircled around the body, covering every inch of available skin that was there. Unless the woman had nothing else to do that day, which is very much a possibility, unfortunately.
Perhaps it's just for reclining gracefully while waiting.
You try sitting in that
leaning. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Propping yourself up against a column somewhere. Yeah. It's a bit like heels.
As you snap at slaves, you got time to lean, you got time to clean.
Yeah, and when we think about the materials that these fabrics would have been made in, so wool or linen or silk, these kind of organic
linen.
Yeah, I know, linen is heavy.
What else? It crushes.
There was no ironing.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I'm just like, ugh.
Yeah, but by the time you do all of that and then you put an elaborate hairstyle on top, geez, it would have taken 10 hours just to get ready.
Well, it makes a lot of sense, really, that that's what you do. That's your job.
But this sounds like it might be more of a conspicuous display of position
Oh, certainly.
than anything else.
Yes, female dress is certainly related with status. This we know. They didn't have an official uniform the same way that men do with the toga and all of their various insignia and these kinds of things. But female dress was important. It was recognised, and it was something that if you were wearing particular colours or particular styles, surely we think, you know, caveat. Yeah. Not quite sure. But it definitely communicated to other people that you belonged to a certain position of your society.
Which makes sense. I mean, in this kind of a world, well, I mean, to be honest, in our world, I can't really say it's only something in the ancient world, can I? But yeah, conveying who you are and where you are in the society is obviously, you know, important just by looking at someone, you know, because you're not necessarily going to be interacting beyond that. You want to know exactly who they are. Yeah. Is there a moral dimension to this, do you think?
Oh, that's a good question. So, no. Is the answer. No, it's not the answer, and some people would certainly disagree with me when I say no.
Okay.
And that's fair enough. They're entitled to their opinion. But in my, I would say, sort of learned opinion, I don't think that the palla or head covering garments in general had a huge moral impact or moral. I don't think that they could signify moral status in the same way that actions and familial status could.
Interesting.
I think that perhaps the representation of the garment is more closely linked when it covers the head with a representation of motherhood. So equating the woman represented as such as a mater familias. But that's not to say that representations of women without head coverings cannot be mothers. So
it's
it really depends on the context.
Yes, well, it's not like you give birth and all of a sudden you have a piece of cloth stuck to your head.
Yeah.
That seems unlikely.
Yeah, definitely unlikely.
But we certainly have cases where, like, a lot of arguments are made for, say, the dress of Vestal Virgins, which is the only dress really that I'm familiar with, where it's like it connotes something about their purity, and that's part of the deal that's going on there.
And with the Vestals, it's a totally different ball game. Like, there's religion involved. There's all these different things going on, which are way more important than just your average married lady going about the street.
I guess I just find it so interesting because, as I said, in films, these kinds of head coverings are exactly the kind of clothing that is often left out altogether, you know.
Well, yeah, because it's hard to wear, hard to walk in.
Yeah, and I think also it like obscures the face of the actress, potentially.
Obscures the face. And also Hollywood is very scared of, Islam. So,
yes, that's true.
So getting rid of those garments is sometimes a political choice.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
That I certainly don't condone.
Yeah.
Because they were there. And as we can see, like, a lot of the evidence that I looked at in my PhD was actually from the Greek East. And you can see the prevalence of these garments there. They may not always cover the face.
No.
In the same way that your more conservative Islamic garments do.
Yeah.
But they are there, and they're there for different reasons in each individual instance. And I think it's difficult because we can't ask these women why they wore these things. We can't go and do that, but in modern day we can.
Yeah,
and
true.
We should.
Yeah.
More and more. So, yeah.
Can you tell us about any particular examples that you found really interesting? I know this is an unusual thing I'm asking you to do on a podcast, but I assure listeners that if they go to our website, we will have images of the things that the future Dr. Smith is about to tell us about.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I would love to talk about some examples. I sort of had two in mind that are quite different, but both representations of women that are dedicated by the women themselves. So I think that these instances give us much more of an insight into how the woman wants to be seen.
So I'm presuming that these are from probably like the Roman period, even if they're from the Greek East.
Yeah. Roman period. One is actually from Italy, thank God. But the other one that I have for you is from Macedonia.
Okay.
So yeah, it's Roman period, and we're looking quite late. So after 212.
Okay, yeah.
So everybody's a citizen. It's all good.
Yeah.
All right. So to position our listeners in
Yeah.
terms of like what's going on in our narrative, we're about 600 years behind.
Sorry.
We've now no. This is really exciting. So we've jumped ahead into the imperial period, but also now we're really solidly in the imperial period.
Most definitely.
Big time.
Yeah, and the Roman Empire is huge.
Yeah, Rome's influence is massive, but it's also consistently engaging in like a cultural exchange with every area that it's in contact with.
Very true.
Yeah, and the thing that tends to distinguish Roman women from Greek women is that they seem to have a little bit more autonomy when it comes to managing their own property and finances, which means that they could actually pay for their own
these two women that I wanted to talk about today. One is called Epictetus, and there's a really nerdy joke that I have about Epictetus.
Oh,
Can
yeah.
I tell it?
Yeah. Yes, please.
So Epictetus, you just add an H, like just add water, and you have epic thesis.
Oh. And we will note that this piece of evidence is in Liz's thesis.
Yeah.
Oh, it is. And the second one is dedicated. It's a tomb. Oh, sorry, not a tomb, a sarcophagus dedicated by a woman called Aurelia Eutychia. And Eutychia is an interesting sort of personal name because it means, in Greek, it translates to I am prosperous or I am fortunate. So it has all of these roots, and it's very, very interesting to see what the name could mean.
It certainly doesn't sound Latin. So.
No, the Aurelia is though.
Yeah,
so
the Aurelia is.
Yeah, we go from there. But talking about Epictetus first.
Yeah.
So I have a monument that she dedicated to her husband and her children. And unfortunately from the inscription, which we'll upload a picture of, I'm sure, it seems that Epictetus outlived her entire family.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's
so
really tables turned, isn't it?
It's really sad.
I feel like this is the lot of women, though.
Oh, yeah.
In many respects.
Yeah, so from what I, trying to have a more empathetic position with these women represented in these monuments, I think we can see that she was probably a really strong person who went through a lot. And in the monument that she dedicates to her husband and her children and herself, she represents herself along with her husband in your average everyday garb. Well, everyday meaning the most idealistic version that we know of. So he is a Paleatus, I think. And she is dressed in a statue pose called the large Herculaneum woman type, which has nothing to do with Herculaneum, I should specify.
All largeness necessarily.
Yes.
I'm looking at the image.
The type just generally refers to the arrangement of the drapery, and if you search large Herculaneum and small Herculaneum women, there's a wealth of scholarly material out there on these statues, and the eponymous ones are found in Herculaneum, hence their namesake.
Okay.
Right.
Is there something specific that distinguishes out the large Herculaneum type, in your opinion?
Yes, and it's agreed amongst scholars. So the drapery is held in a triangular fashion across the chest. It's what's referred to as a closed pose.
What I like to think of, Dr. G, as the Batman position.
Yeah. That's pretty cool, actually. And women who are represented in the large Herculaneum type are usually represented with the head covered by the palla. So the palla is draped around the shoulders and various other parts of the body and pulled up over the head to form a veil.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a very, every inch of the skin is covered, essentially, in this pose. So in Epictetus's relief, we have her on the right-hand side and her husband, who is unnamed, importantly, yes.
Wow.
Doesn't give him a name, but she does say that he is Macedonian. So rather than saying his name, she wants to point out that he's Macedonian. So perhaps that's just a little sort of snide comment on Rome's influence in the region, saying we are Macedonian.
That's really interesting. The fact, because so much of what we understand of the way that Rome operates is about patrilineal lines.
Yeah.
So a deliberate unnaming of
Yes.
the husband. Very curious.
Oh, we have
Very
so many
curious.
instances where the woman isn't named. You know, just in sources in
Oh,
general.
yeah.
So yeah, I'm quite flabbergasted.
Yeah.
This is most of our problem in trying to create any stemmers at all for Roman families, is that we're like, well, which woman was it? They were all called Tertia. No.
Yeah, well, there is only one Epictetus. No, I lie. Her name's actually pretty common. Side note, when I was initially translating the inscription for this, I didn't realise that it was a personal name, and for a long time I was looking for the meaning of this word, and then I realised, oh, that's actually should be
Well, I was
just
going to say,
a
actually,
capital
it's
G.
not, it doesn't sound like a very common name for a woman.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm terrible with languages, everyone will say, but yeah, that would not strike me as a name either.
Yeah, it didn't strike me as a name either, funnily enough.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are other examples of it, as you
Yeah.
can check in the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names, as
I'll
I
be sure to do that.
eventually did. It's a
That, my
very
friends,
large,
yeah.
very plain book.
But very useful for inscriptions.
Oh, yeah, totally. But yeah, another note is that she doesn't name her children either in the inscription.
I feel like that's kind of, you know.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
but the representation says it all. So while her and her husband are dressed in what appears to be mortal clothing, you know, they're not represented as gods or deities or anything.
Yeah.
Her children are.
Huh.
So her son is represented as Hercules, and he's nude. And he's carrying a club and a sheepskin. And her daughter is represented in the bathing Aphrodite type, which is very
That's creepy.
sexy.
Yeah.
Do we know how old these children were when they passed?
No.
Okay.
Dr. G,
we
I just
don't.
got a question for you. New logo?
I think it's time to update.
Yeah. But I think what we can draw from this particular relief, and coming back to the fact that in this representation Epictetus has a head covering, is that she's picking idealized forms for each of her family members. She wants her husband to be represented as the largest figure on the monument. His head is bigger than everybody else. His stance is large. Everything about him is big. So that's nice.
I heard he's a Macedonian.
The way it sounds, I get what you're coming at with, like, the whole, you know, Roman Empire kind of thing. But to me, it sounds like saying, I married a pool boy.
Yeah.
And the children were just divine.
Yeah, they were, and then they died.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Awkward.
Yeah, awkward. So she's got her husband in his perfect form. She's got her children in their deified perfect forms as she wants them to be remembered. And then you look at how she's represented. She looks elegant. She looks poised. She's got all the markers of an elite feminine woman. And so in this context, you can sort of say that the presence of the head covering garment is a contributor to that fact. And the fact that Epictetus is also a mother, therefore it might also be linked with signifying that.
Absolutely.
But that's my guess.
Well, look, it would make sense given what you've been saying, and I know that you've looked at, you know, a huge range of, you know, examples.
Yeah, there's a few.
Yeah, just a few. But given what you've been saying, and given what the purpose of this, you know, what obviously her children dying, like, it would make sense to be celebrating her motherhood or putting it at the forefront, because you know, that's what this is all about.
Yeah,
it's about her family. You know?
It's a celebration, and I think there's a point to be made in that her grief must have been like unparalleled. Like, you know, you watch people go through these things in modern day, and you can only imagine how it would feel.
Is it rude to ask if they all died at the same time of the same thing?
Look, the inscription does not give us that information,
Annoying.
as was the issue in most of the monuments that I studied for my thesis. It's, you know, you get one line at most.
Yeah.
And so yeah, we don't know. The only other thing that I could possibly point out is that relative age and size of the figures in reliefs seems to be a thing. So we've got the husband, who's clearly the largest figure, and Epictetus is the next largest, and they're nearly the same height, but he's proportionally larger.
Yeah.
And then we've got the son, and he's proportionally larger again compared to the daughter.
That's true.
So you can look at the age in terms of an order,
Yeah.
but you probably can't gather much more.
Yeah.
The only other thing that I would says that sometimes you have deceased children dressed in adult costume.
Right.
And that can sort of be more of a nod to the life that the child would have led had they survived. So they may have still died as an infant.
Oh, that's sad.
So it's really sad.
Yeah.
This is a really tragic example, I think. I mean, parents mourning children, it's more common in the ancient world than it is today, but it's not any less of a grief, I don't think. And to lose two, I mean, it's just doubling
plus your
the
husband,
pain. And the husband.
I mean, I kind of feel like this must have been like an illness or something that swept through the family, you know.
But I'm also interested in this idea that she's had the choice to represent herself in any way possible, and instead of going for a divine aspect for herself, she's resisted that and held on to a more earthly representation, something that's grounded in the social structure of where she is.
Exactly, and that's what I think makes this monument unique, because we have a lot of stock produced grave monuments from this time and from Greece and Macedonia. You know, the stonemason or the craftsperson would sort of make a whole pile, and you go to the shop and say, yeah, that one sort of works, like I'll have that one. Whereas this one, the deification of two figures and the mortal representation of the other two shows that it's individually produced without a doubt. And because Epictetus has set it up and outlived her family, she's the one commemorating it, and therefore probably decided how everybody would look.
Would you say this costs a fair chunk of change?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Figure monuments were expensive.
Yeah. She's gone in there and the guy's like, well, can I interest you in any of these? And she's like, I want something a bit more bespoke. And then she describes it to him and he's like, oh, look, I don't know.
And she's like, my whole family.
My darling children.
Yeah, she played the female card and got like a sale price.
And he's like, all right, I'll do my best. I can't guarantee that the small Hercules will work out, but I'll try.
Yeah, but
and you surely you want your daughter, like, you know, looking seductively at the audience?
She's going to be like totally nude.
Not even semi-nude. Look, I think that the end result, like 10 out of 10 for effort, because it looks great.
But I will keep being curious, I think, because part of the way that I conceive of this kind of representation, particularly in statuary, is it's all about the projection of the societal self.
Totally.
And so it's really, really quite strange. I feel like if the daughter had been alive, she would not want to be represented in this way.
Probably not.
Because this is kind of flying in the face of all kinds of things to do with modesty and like your relationship with the gods. And to me, this
Aphrodite
becomes more
seems
fascinating
like
the more I think about it.
Yeah, Aphrodite seems like a very strange choice for what seems to be, I mean, as you say,
a child.
It's hard to say how old she actually was, but for a child, Aphrodite seems like sure, Artemis, or, you know. It
is a strange choice. I consulted with a couple of people about it, and they were like, yeah, that's a bit weird.
Yeah. Grief, hey?
On this podcast,
crazy
we only bring you the strangest evidence here.
But yeah, I did pick this particular relief to put on the title page for my thesis. So just as an inside note to say, this thesis is weird.
Are you ready, guys?
Are you ready?
Well, listeners, I hope you're definitely checking out the image that will be on our website to accompany this episode, and also on our Instagram.
Thank you. What you pointed out about the projection of societal values, I think that ties in interestingly with the other monument that I wanted to chat about to you guys today, which I just have to quickly look up.
Is this the Italian one?
The Italian one, yes, found in Ferrara.
Oh, yeah.
Which I always think of Ferraris.
Yeah.
I'm like, is that where the Ferraris come from?
I don't think it is it?
We'll find out when we continue our history of Rome, right through the Renaissance.
I never
right
said
up
I
to
was
the time they start
producing
producing luxury
never said I was a
vehicles.
historian of cars.
I'm not sure, but I'm willing to ask our listeners whether they know the answer.
I bet somebody does, yeah.
So the second monument that I just wanted to chat about is the sarcophagus dedicated by a woman called Aurelia Eutychia to herself notably.
Yes.
And to her husband, Marcus Aurelius Marino. Now, for Australian listeners, that's not Merino the sheep. It's Marino with an M-A-R-I-N-O, which is unfortunate, I know. But anyway.
But the first part of the name sounds pretty cool.
But it turns out that he had a great beard.
Well, he did, if you check our pictures. Which I'm just going to look up also briefly. My apologies, listeners, because I was disorganised.
No, not at all. So Marcus Aurelius is an interesting starter for a name, given the whole emperor connection and all.
This sounds like somebody who may have found their favour as a citizen underneath his rule.
Indeed.
Yes, yeah. And when we look at the date for this monument, it's coming to us from the 250s CE. So yeah. Unfortunately, there's probably no solid connection, but yeah, as we can see, so from it's quite an elaborate sarcophagus.
Definitely. It's like a little house.
It has like little roof tiles and everything.
Yeah, it does. So, and in terms of these societal expectations, what I wanted to point out in terms of this particular monument is its statuesque features.
Yeah.
So statuesque is a good word that we use to describe it when relief monuments, so that is something that is not a statue in the round, uses the features associated with architecture or portrait statues to make the figures on that relief look like a statue. Are you with me?
Yeah, no, I get
okay.
you. Well, because the way that they're like standing out from the stone.
Yes. So
they
they are in a portrait mode, they face the front, they are standing on pedestals, they are surrounded by columns, and they also stand either side of some temple architecture called an aedicula.
Cool. Aedicula?
Anyway. And then on the roof of the sarcophagus, or the lid, sorry, not the roof. It does look like a roof, but anyway, roof, lid, same difference. We have two portrait busts, so that's again another statuesque feature. And then on the sides, we again have... these pictures are pretty intense. So on the sides, again, we've got this temple architecture, and we've got the figures standing on top of podiums. And so they really wanted to communicate to the outside world that they should be considered as people who were important enough to receive statues. But they probably weren't.
And hence the depiction of them on the sarcophagus.
Correct.
Rather than actual statues.
Correct.
If I couldn't have this in life, I'm going to have it in death, goddammit.
So true.
I'm like a bee stick away from having a statue, guys, but all I can afford is the sarcophagus.
That's
One might say I'm auricular away.
That's completely correct, doctors. So, and Peter Stewart has a book called Statues in Roman Society and Roman Art, and many other books where he describes this in much more scholarly terms than I've just described, that I should point out I'm referencing throughout this discussion. So we can see that they're represented as statues. And the other thing that we note about the sarcophagus dedicated by Aurelia Eutychia is that in all three representations of herself on the sarcophagus, she does not wear a head covering. And
true.
This is important because when we look at the literature, the ancient literature that concerns married women, all the men say that, they habitually went around with their heads covered, and all married citizen women did this. Well, Aurelia Eutychia did not, guys. And the thing is, on this sarcophagus, sorry, it's not a tomb, she's pretty sexy as well. So it's a variation of the large
I can see a belly button.
You can see a belly button. And if I hold my cursor just there, you can sort of see the outline of her breast.
Yeah.
And this accentuation of the hip is very important.
Well, I must admit, when I was looking at the first image you showed of the side, I kind of got the feeling that she was, dare I say, a slightly older woman.
Yeah.
Which makes this all the more like, you go, girl.
Well, she is an older woman by the time this was set up, so she lived with her husband for 43 years before he cocked it.
Wow.
But in this way, so I have a little theory about this one. So she's representing herself in this very fecund way, to put it nicely.
She has a rounded stomach and everything.
Yeah, she does. And she's making this massive commemoration to husband number 1, perhaps in an effort to search for husband number 2.
Still got it, boys.
Still got it. But it's probably unsuccessful if we look at it that way.
Well, I suppose this is probably a point to point out that sarcophagi like this in the Roman world weren't made to just be pushed aside and forgotten about.
No.
They were set up in places that people were likely to see them.
So true. And this one was set up in a place called Voghera.
Okay.
And then moved to Ferrara. Sorry, I have just checked that.
Right.
And it's still in Ferrara, actually. You can still go and see it at the Palazzo dei Diamanti in Italy. But also you can just look at pictures of it online, which is incredibly helpful for us Australian historians who travel to Italy every year. But yeah, it was meant to be displayed, and it's decorated on 3 sides. So you can tell what side is the back and where the wall was supposed to be, and you can tell from one of the sides we've got an elaborate gorgon with these 2 sort of Cupid figures doing a little dance and holding some things between them, and they are represented in this temple facade as well.
Yeah.
And then on the other lateral side, you've got the 3rd representation of Aurelia Eutychia in the Dextrarum Junctio pose. So she's holding the hand of her husband. So presumably this is Aurelia, and this is what's his name? Marino.
Marcus.
Yeah, Marcus Aurelius Marino. Yeah, thank you. So from this pose, we can certainly tell that this is a married couple that we're looking at, and notably again, she's not wearing a head covering, which is sort of the crux of my argument.
I definitely can see that in all representations she looks in better condition than he does.
Yeah.
This is perhaps not a surprise.
Yeah.
But I am really curious about the attempt to represent herself as fertile. Because
she clearly would not be.
Yeah, by the time we get to this sarcophagus being produced, it seems very unlikely that she would still be in that phase of her life.
Yes, it's true. And I'm just checking the inscription, and it doesn't say that she had any children.
Aha, so you cracked the case, Dr. Smith.
Patent pending. So in the inscription, and I'll just read it out because it's, I translated it and it was really hard.
Yeah.
So Aurelia Eutychia built this sarcophagus while alive for herself and her husband, Marcus Aurelius Marino, a veteran of Syrian lineage, which is notable, at the behest of the patron, and we don't know who this patron is, and her most dutiful husband, with whom she lived 43 years, by order of the patron out of his own funds. So she set it up, but she didn't pay for it.
Okay.
If someone after the death of both opens it, they will deposit 1,000 sesterces to the tax authorities. You're like, well,
grave robbing.
Yeah, if you rob this, you have to who's gonna? Anyway, don't know how you were gonna police that earlier, but anyway, so there it is, and this inscription does not tell us whether she had any children. So this we don't know for sure.
But there's a sneaky 3rd player to this whole sarcophagus.
There is a sneaky 3rd player who is unnamed, but. If Aurelia Eutychia built, she didn't build the sarcophagus. She commissioned it.
Yeah.
Then she's omitted the name of this 3rd patron, so we don't know who that is.
Very
the plot
interesting.
thickens.
Yeah, I feel like we got a real mystery, because I'm like, well, what would be some reasonable candidates? I suppose it could be some relatives from her own line, so brothers perhaps.
Yeah, brothers, clients, friends of her husband, because a lot of men dedicate things to other men who are not relatives all the time, and they do this kind of thing for fame and fortune and community spirit, I guess. But women are more likely to set things up for relatives or husbands and stuff.
Interesting.
So,
well,
yeah.
I must admit, I found it fascinating to look at these couple of examples, and I cannot wait to see this thesis in publication someday.
I'm going to touch wood on that one.
Before we go, I think the final question I'd like to ask, because it's really interesting to see historians like yourself at work. What would you say were the issues of dealing with the kind of evidence that you've been coming across? I know that's a very big question, but if you could give our listeners some idea of the challenges you had to overcome to...
Two spring to mind. The first challenge being that I am a Roman historian, and then I somehow stupidly managed to pick a topic where most of my evidence came from Greece. Look. That chestnut, where I had to end up learning how to translate Greek inscriptions, which not that Greek isn't hard, but like the inscriptions, like this whole other level of hard, because there's no grammar or syntax that's there to point out what's going on to you, but thankfully they are formulaic. So once you do a couple, you can really get into it.
Guys, I can see a pattern.
Yeah, and I was very lucky to have help on some of those from some very kind scholars who devoted their time.
And that's really, I think, what I would love to see more of in the academic world. More people helping each other out, so that we don't all have to know everything. We can have levels of specialty and then collaborate with people.
Yes, I could not agree more, Dr. Rad. I think the other issue that I came across was being a historian studying in Australia and being a historian of Roman things on the other side of the world, which I'm sure that you two come into contact with this issue on a regular basis.
Even looking at films, Hollywood is not in Australia.
No, it's not. And I did go to Rome for the study of my thesis. I did stay at the wonderful British school for 5 weeks, and I did accomplish a lot there. And I could have used a lot more time there. I should have gone to the British school at Athens. That would have been smart. But we live and learn. But even with those challenges, I think that it's probably worth giving Macquarie University a plug and saying that the department there is exceptionally kind to people who are just trying to do their best.
I agree. I mean, I'm a product of that system, as is Dr. G.
Yeah, I have a lot of time and love for Macquarie. I think just to wrap things up as well, from my perspective, I know in conversations that we've had about this that you've mentioned like the colour on statuary and things like that.
Yeah.
And it's become a bigger and bigger topic that the public is gaining awareness of. And I wonder if you've got anything that you'd like to say about it.
There's probably one thing that I should point out is that technology is really helping this whole topic, because if you got one tiny speck or one tiny fleck of paint that remains on an ancient statue, you can work out what the whole thing looked like. And these kinds of, like, I think it's like laser, but it's non-invasive archaeology, and those kinds of projects, like, more theses need to be written on those and more work needs to be done, because there's still, like, people are still perpetually surprised every time I say, like, oh, but it would have been red. And they go, what?
All I can see is this marble.
Like, but they look so finesse. They look so elegant in white. I'm like, yeah, but that's a little bit racist.
This is the crazy thing. Like, whenever I tell people that it's because there was this period where the people who were finding them were actually like washing the finds and getting the paint off, and so that everything was this sort of white. And it's funny when I show like younger people and my students and that sort of thing what they would have looked like with paint, given these new reconstructions that are coming out, they're always appalled. And they're like, oh my god, it's so tacky. I used to think that the classical world was so chic.
And there's a few more reconstructions coming out that don't use the kind of pop art colour spectrum. They're a little bit more, subtle, fresco oriented. But the other thing to mention in terms of colour too is that Rome is an exceptionally colourful city. Yeah. And when we imagine these statues in white just dotted around, because they were just randomly, they were everywhere. And when you picture them in white, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But when you imagine that they would have been coloured, you go, oh, these statues would have blended. Like there are obviously some that would have stuck out because they were, towering over you on a plinth of 2 meters high with gold and with all of this other fancy stuff. But a lot of the statues would have artfully blended into their surroundings, and they would have just been part and parcel as a Roman. You're walking around and you see, oh yeah, there's a statue of such and such, and you may not even be able to read the dedication, but you know who it's for.
Well, and I think the other thing is as well, we have to remember that the reconstructions are obviously showing us what they would have looked like day one.
Oh yeah.
Rome is also a pretty filthy city.
Yeah, like can you imagine a statue of Fulvia or Cornelia or like with just some bird poo on it?
It doesn't take long.
No, it kind of like dashes the whole elite feminine perspective, doesn't it?
Veil or no veil, we all get shat on.
And it seems to me that that's the kind of like the legacy that you might end up with as a statue as well, is like it could be defaced in various ways.
Damnatio memoria was a thing.
Yes. Yeah, and not just in that permanent way, but just a smear of shit, you know?
One day
you've got a statue in the forum, the next day you're like, oh well, that's unpleasant.
Some drunken young patricians come by and knock your hand off, like
who doesn't like me? Who have I upset now?
And then when you get to the medieval period, you've got statues that have just been knocked over and being repurposed to melt down in lime kilns. You're like, oh, that's so depressing.
Yeah.
Where did you end up?
Sad times indeed.
Anyway, thank you so much for taking time out to talk to us today. I have been most fascinated because I'm someone who focuses mostly on written sources or film. Statues are something that I'm not particularly familiar with, and I often overlook.
Oh, you're
Dr.
very welcome.
Dr. G has more familiarity because of Vestals, but
I do slightly, but I would say that I'm not an expert in the way that you're an expert. So thank you so much.
Oh, I'm hardly an expert, and thank you so much for the invitation to come on your wonderful podcast. It's been an amazing experience, and I'm truly grateful.